there are plenty of videos that compare the UK to Australia or America to Australia, but I really enjoy looking at these videos when it's actually just comparing the UK with America and then seeing how that actually compares with Australia. So it's like a three-way comparison. So in this video, this is by a creator called Girl Gone London, and she apparently has lived in the UK for 10 years. I don't know when that description was written, so maybe longer, who knows. But she does a lot of UK based videos. Obviously, none of her videos are about Australia, but I found this one interesting because she was talking about habits, American habits, that are considered rude in the UK. And I thought, well, logically, they're probably also considered rude in Australia. So I wanted to check it out and see how it compares. So let's jump in and have a look.
Hi and welcome back to the Girl Gone London channel. If you're new here, my name is Kaylin. I'm an American who's lived in the UK for over 10 years, and today we're talking about 7 American habits that are considered rude in the UK. I have accumulated many of these examples personally, as well as stories I've heard from fellow American expats who live in the UK and are usually trying to do their best, but are sometimes accidentally being rude or just weird.
I like that she's going into this being totally upfront. These are things that she's learned from her own experiences. So she's not trying to give the impression that she's a saint. She's saying, learn from my mistakes. There's just something about her that I like. I think she's just not pretentious. She comes across as a genuine person.
Now, the first thing on my list of an American thing to do that would be considered rude or not acceptable or just strange in the UK is giving a guest a house tour. So in the States, it's not considered weird. Americans love giving a house tour. A visitor comes over to your house and you want to show them around your house. And I know that the British people in the audience are initially going to think, well, it's because Americans want to show off their house. And we don't do that here. We don't brag about things like Americans do. And in some ways, that could be true. You could be proud of your house or things that you've done to it.
Okay, so straight off the mark, Australia is actually more like America. It's just normal here in Australia that the first time someone comes to your place, if they're obviously a friend or a relative, not some perfect stranger, like you're not going to have, if someone knocks on your door and tries to sell you religion, you're not going to say, come and have a tour of my house. But yeah, if it's a friend or a family member and they're coming to your house for the first time, straight up you do a, hey, do you want to have a quick tour? And you show them around. And yeah, it's not about being like, oh, my house is better than yours. It's a cultural thing. I think she does explain this a bit more further on, so I'll go more into that in a little while.
And maybe you do want to show it to somebody for some appreciation. However, there is also another element to this to consider. Now, what I've come across in the UK is that your house is considered a very personal space for the people who live there. And of course, you can have visitors over, and people do have visitors over at times, but it seems to be that British people love meeting out and about. So typically, a British home is going to be smaller than an American home in many instances. So practically, it doesn't always make sense to have people in your space. But equally, in the UK, we have pub culture and restaurants that allow you to sit and enjoy your meal for more than like 20 minutes. So in the UK, meeting friends and meeting people out is much more done than in the US. In the US, we do enjoy our home as a place to have people over for longer periods of time.
Okay, so that's actually very different when you think about it, because in Australia we have the cafe culture, the pub culture. We do enjoy meeting people somewhere and having a coffee somewhere with people. But we still, if someone comes to our house, we'll give them a guided tour. Perhaps we do have a bit more time out and about with our friends than actually inviting them back to our house. But at the same time, you do have occasions where you might invite someone round for coffee. Um, it, yeah, I'm not sure about it being more to do with that Americans spend more time with their friends in their houses than going out to cafes, because in Australia, I think it's much of muchness. We do love going to cafes with our friends, and we possibly do that more than having people drop in at our houses. I mean, here, if someone's going to drop in, it's not a family member, then they're going to ring you first. Or if they aren't close enough to you, then they're going to wait for an invitation. But yeah, I'm not sure if that whole reasoning really works.
And so this reflects back on why Americans love giving a house tour, because in some ways we are trying to make our guests feel at home. And I'm not in any way saying that we're showing them our underwear drawer, but you might show them around and take them around your house in kind of a welcoming kind of way. This isn't done in the UK. So if you have people over, they stick to the rooms that they're allowed in. Most of the house, you like practically board up when someone's coming over, and that's where the visitor is supposed to be. And again, I'm not saying Americans like have guests to their home just wandering every inch of your space, but when they would come to the door, you would welcome them in, and if they haven't been to your home before, you would usually give them some type of tour.
I think what she's saying there with regards to in homes in England, where you go to someone's home and you go to one room, and that's, you don't stray around the house. That is more of that points more to the class distinctions, doesn't it? It's so traditional for British homes to have I can't even remember what the word is, but a separate room that's the room with the really nice furniture, that's where you meet guests. Whereas we don't have that in Australia, and presumably they don't have that in America. In England, that room is pretty much only ever used when you have guests come around. And it's, supposed to be impressive, and that's the front line, so they don't see the rest of your house. Whereas Australia, it's just relaxed. Someone comes round, you only have one living room. So you're all going to sit in the same living room. And yeah, no, we're not going to be like, people aren't going to be wandering around and thoroughly inspecting your bedroom. It's just the thing that you do, that you're like, well, here's my bedroom, here's my studio, yada yada. So I think she's got a definite point there about in England you only ever take guests into one room, and I think that is definitely going back to the traditional class distinction thing, where essentially if someone came around, they didn't see the rest of your house, they saw that room that was specifically for you to meet guests in.
Now, the tour of my house in the UK would be over in about 30 seconds because, as I said, typically homes in the UK are smaller than in the US. But again, this would be considered weird or rude in the UK because it would mostly be seen as you're trying to show off your home, and that's something that is not done. Now, the next thing on my list actually has to do with American servers within a restaurant and the behavior that would be considered rude, which is not only constantly checking in on you and kind of, in some ways, probably to a British person, bothering you during your meal, but in the US, servers, just as a general rule, this isn't just one person or considered rude or anything, they will give you your check or your bill for the meal basically as soon as they've delivered the food. If not that, like a couple minutes after.
Yeah, see, that wouldn't fly in Australia either. If a restaurant was doing that to their customers, people wouldn't go back. You go somewhere to eat out, you might get one check-in, like as you finish your meal, when they're taking your plate, they might ask you, how was your meal? Or they might, if you haven't eaten it all, ask, oh, was everything okay with your meal? But they're not going to pester you while you are eating. And certainly, if someone were to give you the bill for your meal just after they'd served you while you were still eating, that would be considered so very, very rude. You know, I mean, that's become a very old-fashioned thing here in Australia anyway, and you see fewer and fewer places that would bring you your bill to the table. But were it to occur, it would happen after you had finished eating. And certainly after offering desserts or drinks or anything else, you know, they come round with the bill when they can see that you are finished and just about ready to leave. But that said, these days you either pay for your meal before you sit down or you go to the cash register on your way out and pay. It's becoming less and less of a thing for them to actually bring a bill to the table.
That would be considered extremely weird and extremely rude in the UK, as if your server is trying to get rid of you. But the thing is, in America, they kind of are, because they rely on tips, which is an entirely different video, and so much of their wage comes from being able to turn over tables quickly. And this would never fly in the UK. The restaurant experience is totally different. And so if a British family does go to the US, that's something to remember, that the American waiter or waitress is not within the context of American culture being rude by giving you your bill for the meal really soon after they serve you your food.
You know, the big part of dining out is just the experience of being able to savour your meal, of being able to have conversations, of not having to rush. So, yeah, Australia is very much like the UK there, and Australians would be really, really PO'd if they were being rushed out of a restaurant. The only plus side I can see to it is that presumably in the United States you wouldn't have to wait long to be actually given your meal. You wouldn't have to wait long between courses, because if they're trying to keep people moving, they're not going to leave you sitting there waiting for 20 minutes while someone else on the table has already had their meal. Which does happen here, unfortunately.
Another American habit that is considered rude in the UK has to do with eating as well, and that is to do with what you do with your knife and fork after you finish a meal. So in the UK, the polite thing and general thing you're supposed to do, and people just seem to do as a matter of like not even thinking about it, is you put your utensils together on your plate and it looks something like this. And this is not really done in the US. So there is no official signal for I have finished my food or I am done with my meal. And you kind of just leave your utensils wherever you want to leave them. They could be on the plate, they could be off the plate, they could be making a cross, they could be like just stacked in any weird old way. You basically just throw your utensils down and that means you're done. That is considered rude in the UK in the sense that it's just the polite thing to do to finish your meal by putting your utensils together on the plate, which is something that I have gotten better at remembering to do, but I still have to sometimes remember to do it naturally, and I see other people around me in the UK just doing this naturally, and I have to remember to gather all of my utensils and put them in this line on the plate to show that I'm done.
I think that if the UK is anything like Australia, that it is something that is drummed into you from an early age. If you are finished, you put your knife and fork together. If you are still eating and you don't want someone to take your plate, you put your knife and fork down in a triangle shape, essentially. So I find it really interesting that they don't do that in the United States. That then I guess at the same time, what she's saying about dining culture, I guess in restaurants at the very least, which is, you know, where this kind of etiquette becomes really important, in restaurants in the United States, I'd imagine that if you put your servingware down or put your cutlery down, that wherever you put it, that'd be like a signal that you are done, and they'd whip your plate away. So it comes again down to taking time with your meal, I guess. But I find it fascinating that they don't do that in America, because it is such a big thing here in Australia too. You just, yeah, you have it taught to you from a young age. You just do it automatically, because from a very young age you're being corrected and told if you're finished, put your knife and fork down like that.
The next thing on my list is Americans being loud. So, I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say that we're not loud. We are loud. Honestly, I was considered a quiet person in the US. I spent my entire life in the US with people asking me to speak up and to talk louder because they couldn't hear me. I moved to the UK, and within a couple days, people are telling me to be quiet. Americans just speak loudly. We just are loud, and it's a trait that is considered relatively rude in the UK because it's infringing on other people's right to enjoy the environment surrounding them. And this is particularly prevalent with Americans on like public transportation in the UK. So if you take the tube in London or a train, you can usually hear the Americans before you can see them. It's just, we're not trying to be rude. We just culturally are loud. And another thing to remember the next time you hear a loud American in the UK is that within the country that we're from, because everybody is loud, you have to speak louder and louder and louder to be heard over the other people. So it doesn't come across as being loud in the US because everybody's being loud. Whereas here in the UK, definitely people are a bit more reserved and a bit more quiet, and suddenly I become the loudest person in the room.
So I actually think that in the UK, some Australians would be considered too loud. We can be a mouthy bunch when we get going, and we don't hold back on our swearing, which is something which is not appreciated by Americans or British. So I think while I see what she's saying in terms of the British not liking loud Americans, and we're the same in Australia, we don't like the really loud Americans, but at the same time, people like her, people like Caitlin from Kind of Australian, people like Tia and Chevio from One Pack Wanderers, they seem to fit in perfectly fine here in Australia. So I think perhaps Britain is even more reserved, or I think we know that Britain is even far more reserved than Australia.
The next American habit that's considered rude in the UK, and this is definitely a little bit of a cringy one, is not saying please or thank you or please can you do this, not having those like niceties attached to what you're saying. And this is definitely one of those things I notice when I'm in the US. An example would be if you are in a store and asking where something is. In the UK, you would go up to a person and you would say, "Oh, sorry, can you please tell me where the flour is?" Or you would just have all these different words to say, "Excuse me," "Please can you help me?" or something like that. In the US, a lot of people, and this does depend on region a little bit, but a lot of people would just go up to the person in the store and they wouldn't have any of these other words. They would just say, "Where's the flour?" And they might say it in a way that to us in the States is still a nice way of saying it. I'm not saying that they're going to be demanding. We could still say it nicely, but we wouldn't include the other words like "excuse me," "please can you help me," "can you do this?" We would just kind of go in directly with our question. And in some ways, this may have to do with the American style of direct communication that I talked about in a previous video, but overall, it is just sort of bad manners in the UK and in most countries, so I'm not siding with the Americans on this one, but bad manners to not be saying please, not be saying thank you, and things like that.
Here in Australia, it would just feel unnatural not to approach someone in the store and start out with "excuse me" or "I'm sorry, but." It's a social mores. You would not do it. And I think that is one of the reasons why quite often when Americans come to Australia, they get such a bad rap because they do just, you know, blurt it out like that without any of the social niceties. So, yeah, that's a good point, and I think definitely Australia is so much like the UK there. Possibly the big difference, though, between the UK and Australia when it comes to that sort of thing is that if someone is being direct like that and seen as being rude, Australians will probably get snarky and put them in their place. We tend not to tolerate that sort of crap here in Australia. Whereas in the UK, they might just get their feathers ruffled a little bit and sound a little bit hoity-toity perhaps. I don't know, I've never been to the UK, but that's what I'm kind of thinking.
And the next thing on my list that Americans do that can be considered weird in the UK is talking very openly about religion and asking people questions about their religion. And what I mean by this is, in the UK, religion is seen as a personal thing. So you might go to church, you might not, you might go to another religious venue, you might not, but you're not going to expect people that you don't know to ask you about it. In the US, this is a little different. As a country, America is much more religious than the UK, and it is seen as more appropriate to ask a stranger maybe where they go to church, because the assumption is that a lot of people do, especially in certain parts of the US, or you might ask them what religion they are. And again, there's going to be differing experiences of this depending on where you live in America and your age and, you know, your social group and things like that. But as a general rule, it's more acceptable in the US to speak about and to ask strangers or acquaintances about religion. In the UK, this is definitely considered rude and not acceptable because religion is viewed as a much more intensely personal and private thing.
Yeah, I think you could say that Australia is very much like the UK there too. We are nothing like the United States when it comes to talking about religion. Here in Australia, it's almost considered rude to be talking about religion or asking people if they go to church or where they go to church, unless, of course, it's brought up in some sort of context. Whereas in America, it is one of those things where you would almost be rejected, I gather, if you didn't go to church. And it's almost like part of the social mores there in America to discuss religion, to show people that you are a good religious person. Whereas in Australia, it's more about how you treat people rather than what your religion is.
And the final thing on my list has to do with queuing. Of course it does. The American habit that is considered rude in the UK is essentially pushing to the front of things or taking things before you wait your turn or you ask. In the UK, the art of queuing is well known. People are very good at it. People are good at lining up, waiting for things, waiting your turn. The British way is sort of just being like, no, you go first. No, you go first. Or just really having a sense of order when it comes to who gets what next. In America, it is kind of everyone for yourself. We are very bad at lining up. I don't know if you've seen the scene in an iconic American Christmas film called Jingle All the Way with Arnold Schwarzenegger, of all people. But there is a scene when they get a toy into the toy shop that all the parents want, and they essentially trample each other to get to it. This has happened in the US. This is something that I watch and I'm like, yes, this makes sense for America. This is kind of how we operate. And we can even take it from the funny, silly, like, physical example of, you know, not being able to line up or like rushing into a toy shop or something like that. But it also tends to extend to other areas as well. So as an example, there was one time when I was on a plane traveling with a British person and the plane had empty seats in the same like economy section that we booked. So it wasn't like first class empty seats, but there were empty seats and there were seats that I would have preferred to sit in more than the one that I had, but there weren't that many empty seats. So my American self was like, we're just gonna move. We're just gonna move. We're not gonna ask. We're just gonna go and move to these other seats that are empty. And this has always worked for me. This is just the American way. I see something that's open. I'm like, okay, nobody else is using this and it's in the same class that I've booked. So I'm just gonna go and sit there. I'm gonna take it. The British person that I was with was like, we can't just move. We have to ask. And I'm like, you don't have to ask. You just do it and then it happens. But the British way can be seen as much more polite and less rude, to not just go and assume you can do things, but to ask, to again wait your turn. Is it okay if I go and sit in that other seat? Where the American in me was just like, no one else is doing it, so I'm gonna go and do it. Or if you're in a grocery store or something similar, maybe you come up to an item that is running out and you get to it at the same time as another person. In the UK, it's often the polite thing to say, oh no, go ahead, you have it, you take it. An American is like, no, I got here 0.3 seconds before you, I'm taking this, have a nice day. I'm not saying it's the best trait to have. I'm just saying that is what Americans are kind of conditioned to be like. You can call it entitled or you can call it bold, whatever you want to see it as. That is definitely an American habit that is not considered acceptable and is considered rude in the UK.
Yeah, that's definitely very much the same here in Australia. I mean, in Australia, if someone tries to cut in line, there's going to be someone who mouths off at them. And, you know, if you're lining up to get to a checkout and someone jumps ahead of the queue, then chances are the person who is about to go up is going to comment to them like, excuse me, but I was next. I've done that myself, and I'm actually normally a fairly reserved person. Definitely the changing seats in an airplane, heck, I wouldn't do that without asking. I think most people I know here in Australia wouldn't do that without asking. But that said, since COVID, when you go to the cinemas these days, you have an allocated seat. Whereas, you know, in the old days it used to be you went in and you picked where you want to sit. You walked into the cinema and you chose the best seat that was available. Now you've got to actually choose your seat before you go in. I went in the other day to watch Wicked, which is brilliant by the way, and realised that the seat that I'd chosen was way up a bunch of stairs. I really wasn't in a mood for climbing a bunch of stairs. I have a really bad ankle, which makes climbing stairs really difficult. So I just went up probably 2 rows and grabbed a seat. And even that made me feel uncomfortable, even though the cinema was only half full. And had someone come in and said, excuse me, that's my seat, I would have quite happily moved. But, you know, for the most part, in Australia, we're not going to do that sort of thing. If we're told this is where you sit, this is where we sit, unless we can ask someone to change it. Okay, so I think she's made some really good points in this video. I expected them all to be like Australia, more like the UK. So it was interesting to see a few things where Australia did kind of align more with America. But I guess we're kind of a bit like the piggy in the middle, aren't we? We're not as loud and brash as Americans, but we're also not as quiet and conservative as the British. So yeah, I can see how it can be that in some instances we are more like Americans and other times more like British. So that brings us to the end of her video. I thought it was quite well thought out. I liked what she was saying, and there were a few surprising things in there. So thanks for listening. If you're new, please subscribe to my channel. Also, regardless of new or not, please hit the like button and also leave a comment. This helps my videos get seen by more people and helps me to continue with this channel. So thanks, and I'll catch you in the next one.